And the meeting is now being recorded. So Casey, I'm going to turn it over to you for a moment.
Fantastic. I will say it again. Thank you everybody for coming and joining us today. My name's Casey. I'm with Izzard, and Chastity and Kelly are with us today, and we're just going to continue to let people in, but we're going to turn over the ranks to Therese Sandiomersky from Florida PBIS, who's here with us today to discuss alternatives to suspension. All of these presentations and handouts will be sent to you via email after the presentation, as well as the recording, and they will be on our live binders page for you all to download and access as well. I hope everybody stays safe over the next couple of days, and if there's anything that we can do for you, please don't hesitate to let us know. Chastity and Kelly and I will be monitoring the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in there, and we will make certain that they are answered. If not today, afterwards via email or phone call or whatever you all need. Thank you so much, Therese, and I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Casey. I appreciate it. Folks at Izzard are always so supportive, so I love the opportunity to get to collaborate with you all. So as Casey mentioned, my name's Therese Sandiomersky. I work with Florida's PBIS project. Our project's mission is to build district capacity for implementing multi-tiered PBIS frameworks, right? So this is part of a multi-tiered system of support that takes a very positive and educational and proactive approach to supporting student and staff behavior. I've been with the project full-time since 2006. Before that, I was a graduate assistant with the project for a few years while I completed my PhD in school psychology. My background area of interest, I think right now, probably my main one is discipline disproportionality. So that's something that I'm very passionate about addressing, but I'm also very interested in other fields such as restorative practices, relationship-based discipline, and pretty much anything PBIS. So that's me. And if you'd like to look up more information about me, you can go to our project's website, www.flpbis.org, and go to our about page or our contact page, and you can see our different staff profiles. All right, so what we are working on here today, these are our objectives. So we're going to spend a little bit of time up front talking about changes in and implications of school discipline outcomes. We're going to identify some common disciplinary issues that can impact students with disabilities in particular, and we'll summarize some effective approaches and some more specific strategies for reducing suspension. So as we go along today, please feel free if you have a question or comment, if you want to type that into the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and actually talk to me, please feel free to do that. Every chat that I've ever been in, like sometimes you get worried that a lot of people will talk over each other, but so far in all the time that we've been online, that has not happened. So please, by all means, especially considering all of the things that are going on for folks today, if you'd like to interact with me through your microphone, please feel free to do that. In terms of the specific content that we're going to be covering in the next couple of hours together, you can see the different topics listed out here on the slide. Again, these different topics support those specific learning objectives. What I was thinking with the slide is that sometimes people would like to know in advance what are the different strategies and approaches you're going to cover. So if you already know all these things, then you kind of know what you're in store for. And if you see some things that are new, then you'll know that there is some new information available to you. All right, so those are the different topics we will cover. Now, this very first activity is one of those type into chat activities. So feel free to type into the chat box your response to this prompt if you can. Did your school have an increase in suspension rates last school year? So talking about the 2021-22 school year, did your school have an increase in suspension rates? Now, if you're not able to chat, feel free. You can use those reaction buttons in Zoom, or you can use your microphones too.
Currently, it says the chat is disabled.
Uh-oh. Well, that is not correct. Bear with me. I am just checking the settings. And I need to go into another part. I'm going to pause the recording just for a moment here. And we are recording again. Okay, so now that we can chat, could folks type into the chat if you are able? Did your school have an increase in suspension last school year? I'm seeing yes. And Gadsden, Florida, excellent. Yes, we saw an increase. We saw increases. We have one person say, no, there was no increase. That's good. That is wonderful. All right. We saw an increase, remains steady, and first year. So it's kind of hard to tell if it's your first year, which is completely logical. It makes total sense. So it's hard to know unless you were there last year. All right. So the reason why I asked that question, I'm actually going to build up to the next question here. Let me ask your opinion now. Given your experiences last year, what do you think it was like for other schools across the country or across even just the South region of our country? What percentage, if you had to guess, what percentage of public schools do you think experienced more challenges with student behavior last year? You think like 10% of schools had an increase? Do you think 90% of schools had an increase? 50%, 80%, 80%, 65%. So you're seeing a few responses, more than half, 75, 95, 80. You all are good. I have a feeling that you might have seen the same report where I got this information from. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up those graphs. So here we go. So what I discovered is over the summer, the Institute for Education Sciences, or IES, which is the Statistics Research and Evaluation arm of the U.S. Department of Education, they initiated a study called the Student Pulse Panel, which collects information on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic from a national sample of elementary, middle, high, and combined grade public schools. The most recent survey was conducted last spring, so in the spring of 2022, and the results of that study were published in early July. What the results showed, and you can see this in the red colored columns in this graph, is that a little over 80% of schools across the country reported concerns with students' behavioral development this past school year, compared to before the pandemic began. So if you were some of the folks in our chat who said, yes, we had an increase in behavior, know that you are in very good company. Most schools last school year had an increase in behavior. Now, the percentage was slightly higher. It was closer to 90% when school personnel were asked about students' social and life skill development. And in that situation, close to half of the schools in the South, and that's 46% of schools in the South, reported an increase in threats of physical attacks or fights between students compared to 2 years ago. And that's something else that I've heard from my districts, is that not only is there more behavior, but those behaviors are more intense. Now, the majority of schools in the IES study also reported that other rule violations had increased compared to before the pandemic. And that was true for most things except for skipping and truancy. In that particular offense, only 26% of schools in the South reported an increase compared to 2 years ago. So given that all of these other behavioral issues, these other disciplinary infractions were increasing, but skipping and truancy did not increase, why do you think that might be the case? Why do you think skipping and truancy did not jump as much as some of these other behaviors? And you can respond with your microphone or you can respond through chat. Meals. So kids were coming to school to get their food. Some students were glad to be back and they could socialize after COVID, after being separated from their peers for so long. Any other guesses? Casey, getting back to normal. So establishing a sense of normalcy and free Wi-Fi, Aaron, I love that. Good guesses. Oh, and Simone, thank you for that comment. School was a safer and a better place than home. Certainly that can be true for a number of our students. You know, I was trying to figure out why that particular offense might have stayed the same compared to other behaviors. And so when I was thinking about it, I thought that maybe the relatively smaller increase in the school's reporting, skipping, and truancy might be because more students have just chosen to stay home. And it turns out that there's actually a little bit of data to support that idea. Close to 70% of schools in the study reported an increase in student chronic absenteeism. And not only that, but there's a similar increase in the number of schools reporting chronic teacher absenteeism as well. Now consider that it's been more difficult than ever for schools to find substitute teachers to cover those absences. 75% of schools in the study agreed that this has been more or much more difficult than it was compared to before the pandemic. So what is a school to do when teachers are out and there are no substitutes to be found? Well, you find someone to fill the void, including district staff who don't normally teach in classrooms. Now, this was not a rare occurrence. Oops, sorry, I jumped ahead of myself there. So this was not a rare occurrence in 21-22, as over half the schools in the sample reported that they had to use an alternative strategy like this, where district staff are filling in the classroom, either frequently or very frequently. So not surprisingly, the challenges that have taken place during the last 2 years have had an impact on our students and our staff, but we're going to look at students first. So a majority of schools in the study reported that there's been an increase in students seeking mental health services compared to 2 years ago. So how does that compare to your school? Has anyone joining us today seen an increase in students seeking mental health services compared to this past year? You can give me a thumbs up, you can give me a quick yes. If you agree that those students seeking mental health support has increased, thank you. Alicia, thank you. I've seen an increase. Anyone else? Is it about the same in terms of students seeking mental health support compared to before the pandemic? Simone, thank you. There's been an increase in several of your schools. LaRonda, same. Yeah. So it's not unusual. We have seen spikes in behavior. We've seen more intense behavior. We've seen more students seeking mental health support. Not across the board, but in many cases we have. So with this increased need, it's not always easy to meet that need. Over 50% of schools in the South said that they didn't have adequate access to, or they didn't have enough licensed mental health professionals to meet those current needs. Now, the shortage of mental health professionals is especially concerning, given that the most common mental health service provided to students was individualized intervention, which was used by nearly 90% of schools in the study. The next most common support was case management and external referrals. So those three services, that individual-based intervention, case management, and external referrals, if you had to place those services in a multi-tiered system of support, where would you place them? Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3? You can let me know through chat or through your microphone. Would you put those supports in Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3? Karen says Tier 3. Tier 3, I'm getting a few Tier 3 responses. Yeah, that's exactly where I would put them too. Individual-based intervention, case management, and external referrals are very individualized and probably very intensive services. So they definitely would go into Tier 3, but let's pause and reflect on that. So what do you think might be the consequences of using Tier 3 strategies as a go-to response, knowing that there's been increases in challenging student behavior, increases in absenteeism, and students seeking mental health services, all amid a shortage of mental health professionals? What are the consequences of that? And you don't have to type this out unless you'd like to. Just reflect on that. What would be the consequences of using Tier 3 strategies to respond to these increased needs? So if you're thinking that the consequence would be that school personnel would be feeling overwhelmed when they're trying to address student needs, then I would definitely agree with you. Schools simply don't have the resources to take an individualized approach to addressing the high rates of needs that exist in our schools today. Now, this was true before our school system adopted a multi-tiered system of support, but given what we just saw with this latest survey, I would say that it's even truer today. So the big takeaway message from the data that I just shared with you is that last school year was a challenging year. We're looking at data here that have been shared by schools implementing Tier 1 PBIS. This is preliminary data. But what you see here is that many schools, even with that universal system of support, they found themselves writing more referrals, issuing more suspensions than the year before. And in many cases, they were writing more referrals and suspensions even than they did even before the pandemic happened. So last year was a tough year. If you experienced an increase in behavior and or student need, you are definitely not alone in that. Now, while it's understandable that many schools experienced discipline spikes last year, it's also concerning because of the harmful effects of exclusionary discipline. Now, exclusionary discipline, when we talk about it, it's any form of discipline that removes a student from their classroom community. So that could be time in a different classroom, it could be an office referral, it could be an early send home, in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, and of course, expulsion. This slide summarizes some of the research that's been done on exclusionary discipline, and most of that research has been done on the effects of out-of-school suspension. So as you can see, schools with high suspension rates tend to have a variety of negative outcomes for students as well as staff. So these include a negative impact on school climate, negative perceptions of school administrators, poorer academic and social outcomes, and increases in risk for poor mental health outcomes. On top of this, suspension is least likely to work for students who receive it the most. And we even have research that shows that over half the students who received an out-of-school suspension during the first 3 months of school received another out-of-school suspension later in the year. So if you want to talk about an early warning system, you know that students who are receiving suspensions between August and October are likely to receive more suspensions. So those are good students to identify for extra support. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the effects of exclusion, there will be a couple of handouts that summarize those that will be available for you after the webinar. All right. So on top of those effects, we also know that exclusionary discipline and discipline procedures that are implemented inconsistently, those risk re-traumatizing our students. So if a student's situationally inappropriate behavior is a result of trauma, then we can make the problem worse by excluding students from the classroom or the school community. Now, exclusionary discipline is commonly applied disproportionately as well. So what we're looking at here is based on national data. This is 2015-16 data that was contained in a 2018 report by the Office of Civil Rights. And what we see in this are discipline consequences for students that fall into different categories. So students who are Black, students who are Hispanic, students who are white, and students with disabilities. Across this graph, the red columns that you see is the group's percentage of enrollment. So for example, up here we have students who are Black, and they make up about 15% of the enrollment nationwide. And so with students who are Hispanic, Latino, that's between 20 and 30%, et cetera, et cetera. So what we would expect if things were perfectly balanced in our world is that all of the different disciplinary consequences that are in different shades of blue and green for each group after that first red column, those blue and green columns should all be about the same height as the red enrollment column. And so what you can see is if we cover up everything that is equal to or less than that red column, then you can start to see some patterns emerge. So we can see which groups are most at risk for different exclusionary outcomes. That would be students who are Black, students with disabilities, and also students who are white. There's actually some overlap between the types of consequences students who are white are overrepresented in, and the types of consequences that students with disabilities are overrepresented in. But needless to say, the issue in terms to just not having equitable outcomes is that with students who have disabilities in particular, they have legal requirements for service and support provision that schools might be violating should they use exclusionary discipline on a regular basis with students in this group. So we have a little handout that talks a little bit more about that. But there's also some additional considerations I'd like you guys to be aware of. So out-of-school suspension is not the only administrative action where federal requirements for service provision should be considered. So the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services provides clarifications on the exact requirements and implications of other exclusionary discipline responses, such as the ones you see here on the side. So informal removals, in-school suspensions, and bus suspensions. While I can't officially interpret those requirements for you, I can share that these responses to student behavior do sometimes fall within the range of actions that must be considered in light of federal protections for students who have a disability, which means that these may not be an appropriate alternative to out-of-school suspension for students with disabilities. Now, if you have questions about how these administrative actions should be used in your district, I would encourage you to speak with your district's ESE director and/or your B's contact to get a more formal interpretation of this more recent guidance. All right, so then now what do we do instead of suspension, right? So we've seen the harmful effects and we've seen how much behavior has spiked the last couple of years. So what we're going to do for the rest of our time together is really start looking at some different approaches and specific strategies that we can rely on instead of out-of-school suspension and other exclusionary responses. So to do that, now I know that folks that are here with me today, this is going to be a quick activity. Folks are familiar with a lot of different strategies to use in place of out-of-school suspension. I would like to introduce just a little bit of fun this morning and see if you all can guess one major approach to reducing suspension. So in this activity, what you will do is you can either use your phone and scan that QR code. If you're looking at this online, you might be able to click that link and be taken to the activity. But it's a little game of hangman. So it's a word wall activity. And once you get to the screen, you'll press the little button to play the activity, and you'll find a hangman board, which of course means that you get to guess different letters until you know what the word is supposed to be. So we're going to take a minute or so just to let folks get to the activity and start interacting with that activity. And what I would like you to do is when you have found the correct word that is the key to reducing suspensions, so the correct word is the key to reducing suspensions, come back to our meeting room and type that special word into chat. Now let's see who can identify that word first. Hey, Karen, you are fast. Excellent. So Karen identified it for us. Prevention is the key to reducing suspensions. Thank you for playing along there, Karen. I appreciate that. So yeah, that is it. Now there's a number of different approaches to preventing out-of-school suspension. And so we're going to cover those briefly today, and I'm going to connect you with some different resources for those. Yay, thank you, Chastity. Appreciate that feedback. Okay, so the first broad prevention strategy is Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. So one of the best ways to prevent the need for suspension is to provide a relevant and engaging instructional environment, which is something that I was actually just trying to model for you using that hangman activity. So we know if a child is struggling academically, developmentally, or with mental health, and if they're not provided with appropriate supports or interventions, then disruptive behavior may occur as a signal that the child's needs are not being met. So Universal Design for Learning prompts teachers to include multiple ways of presenting information, multiple ways for students to engage with that instruction, and multiple ways for students to demonstrate what they've learned. And so by creating flexible and responsive instruction, teachers remove unnecessary barriers to student learning, which helps to keep students engaged and reduces the likelihood of rule violating behavior. Now, if you'd like to learn more about specific strategies that can be used for UDL, the PSRTI project offers a free online course on the topic, and they also have monthly newsletters with UDL strategies. So the link to the PSRTI project resources are printed there on the slide for you. So if you are interested in this particular approach, I encourage you to check that out. All right, one important way to ramp up students' instructional engagement is to use instructional strategies that students actually enjoy. So it's one thing to have a variety of strategies, but I think it's important that teachers understand which of those strategies are preferred by their students. And once they understand that, they should actually use those strategies. So getting and incorporating students' perspectives on common instructional strategies will increase student engagement in all aspects of classroom life. Teachers can survey their students at the beginning of the year to find out what their preferences are for different presentation styles, such as lecture, guided note-taking, class-wide peer tutoring, computer-assisted instruction, brief lectures, and so on. Same goes for different response options, like raising their hand, being called on spontaneously during lecture, which we know is everyone's favorite, talking through their answer with a peer before they share publicly, and so on. So teachers can find out student preference for acknowledgement as well. So preferences for acknowledgement such as public verbal praise, private written praise, gestures, tokens, and so on. Another area that's valuable for student voice is the types of rewards that students can earn, such as earning downtime for desired behaviors, getting to participate in activities for desired behaviors, getting to wear their hoodies during class, getting a positive phone call home, and more. The list is really large. Remember that regardless of what you're offering, a reward is not actually reinforcing unless the students actually enjoy it, unless they find that item or activity rewarding. So students have got to see the value in what they can earn. Now, because I'm speaking mostly with school administrators today, you can help teachers acquire and use student voice by providing access to easy survey tools, like Google Forms, of course, is real popular. You might also suggest revisions to policies and practices to explicitly call for teachers to get student voice and/or help teachers collect and/or compile that data. So sometimes teachers just need a little bit of support in terms of processing the results and making some sense out of it. Maybe that's something you can do to support them. Another idea is that you could include various instructional response and recognition options as part of your classroom walkthroughs. So that way, as you're doing those formal and/or informal walkthroughs, you have specific things you're looking for. You can identify teachers who use the widest variety of strategies and ask them to share what they did during a staff meeting, which is actually also a great way to recognize staff for important behaviors while also boosting morale and climate at your school. So a final point to remember is that if your teachers are incorporating student preferences into their instructional routines and students still engage in situationally inappropriate behavior, it may be a sign that the student's need for additional or different instruction, that they may need more specific instruction on some of the micro skills that enable them to participate in those different instructional strategies. So in other words, just because you enjoy or prefer something doesn't always mean that you're necessarily fluent with it, right? So one resource that I can provide to address the idea of differentiating instruction on those micro skills is the matrix that you see here, and it's available on our project's website through the link you see at the bottom of the slide. You'll see going across the top different evidence-based instructional strategies, such as peer collaboration, concept mapping, debates, perspective taking, etc. Now going vertically down the page, and it's actually a 3-page resource, are different micro skills that are needed for students to successfully engage in those different instructional strategies. So for example, if we want to use concept mapping with students, we know that listening is an important micro skill in order to do that. We know that self-control is an important skill to do that, as well as contributing to discussions and asking questions, right? So that kind of breaks down those specific skills for you. Now, as an administrator, if you have a student in your office for disciplinary reasons, and you know that your teacher does a good job with UDL, you might look through this list as you're learning about the disciplinary incident to see which micro skills would have been helpful for that student, given what was happening in the classroom at that time. It may be appropriate to provide some more intensive instruction on those micro skills, which could then serve as a disciplinary consequence for the student's rule violating behavior. So for example, that conference with student becomes more of a social skill instruction sort of disciplinary response. Now, each of the micro skills that you see here and that are in that handout, they are defined and broken down into a short sequence of steps in the 2 books that are listed at the end of this particular resource. So they are the skill streaming for elementary and skill streaming for adolescents. All you would need to do is just follow the steps outlined in those curricula and talk with the student about how your school-wide expectations relate to those micro skills. So for example, using self-control, you might tie back to the school-wide expectation of being responsible, potentially. So the student would then go back to class armed with the skills that they need to be successful and with a clearer understanding of how big a role your Tier 1 expectations play while they're at school. So a couple main things is you identify those skills, instruct on those skills, and make sure those skills are connected to your school-wide expectations. Okay. Another important preventative approach is positive behavioral interventions and supports, or PBIS. Now, PBIS is not a program. It is a framework that's focused on proactive instructional and positive strategies for supporting student, staff, and family behavior. It serves as the umbrella for all other programs, initiatives, and curricula that involve student behavior. So that could include things like attendance, anti-bullying, social skill instruction, character education, drug use prevention, and so on. Now with PBIS, supports such as relationship building, environmental changes, differentiated instruction on situationally appropriate behaviors, recognition for desired behaviors, and functionally relevant responses to behavioral errors. Those are provided to all students. The tiers of support within PBIS are fluid, so that students who need more support receive more support. And supports for students who become more fluent with their target behaviors are faded, just like we do for academic RTI or MTSS. Now, federal law specifically includes PBIS as a requirement for students who have a disability. And the research base supporting PBIS as a means for attaining positive student outcomes is so well established that schools would be hard pressed not to use it as a framework for their behavioral, social, and life skill support. And this is just a little of what that research base looks like. Outcomes for schools that implement PBIS with fidelity, they include things like improved academics, having more competence in behavioral, social, and life skills, having lower rates of exclusionary discipline, improved teacher efficacy for supporting student behavior, improved climate, improved perceptions of school safety, and more. So if you'd like a closer look at the infographic, the link on the side will take you right to it, so you can look at that full document. And of course, any of our FLPBIS project staff are happy to help you out with that should you need it. Now, we're actually going to go into another activity here because I mentioned that you get those outcomes by implementing PBIS with fidelity. Now, the outcomes, they don't just happen because a school has a Dolphin Dollar program or some other school-wide token. Those outcomes that we see in the research base are based on implementation of all 10 critical elements of PBIS. And those 10 critical elements include features that are easy to see, as well as features that are less readily observed. They are also the things that you see in the green slices of pie in the graphic here on the slide. Now, in addition to those 10 critical elements, there are also enhancements to the way Tier 1 is implemented that are important features of a PBIS framework that's implemented with fidelity. And those ideas are listed in the blue areas outside of our pie. Now, I know that a lot of folks on the webinar today are already familiar with PBIS. So rather than provide a lecture on things you know, I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to show me what you know. So for this learning game, the directions are pretty easy. If you remember from Chuck E. Cheese or different amusement areas like that, the whack-a-mole game, we're going to play a whack-a-mole game with 10 critical elements and enhancements of Tier 1 PBIS. So the directions are easy. So you're going to click, either scan in the QR code or click on the link on the slide. It's going to take you to another word wall activity. You'll press that play button that you see in blue when you get to that screen, and it's going to start a whack-a-mole game. So what'll happen is that you'll have these little characters that are each holding a sign up, and the sign might reflect one of the 10 critical elements or important characteristics of Tier 1 PBIS. So for example, teaming is one of those 10 critical elements of PBIS. So you're going to click on a character, you're going to whack the mole that's holding the teaming sign, because that's one of our 10 critical elements. In another example, we know that Tier 1 PBIS should reflect the values and beliefs of the students, family, and staff that are supported by the system. So if one of the characters was holding a sign that said, based on only staff beliefs, you would avoid clicking on that character because that's not a characteristic of PBIS. And one other thing, this is a timed game, and the goal is to get as many correct answers as you can in the least amount of time possible. So I'm going to go ahead and model this activity on my screen. If you are playing along, please play along. I would love to see how folks do with this. And we'll go from there. Karen, I see your question there in the chat. What do we use to design these games? It's actually a website called wordwall.net. And so by clicking on that link, it takes you there. I believe that they have some activities that are free, and they have additional templates that you can use for different types of activities if you have a paid account. And again, it's an affordable kind of a service. So if you enjoy these things, I encourage you to explore their website. I don't get any kickbacks. I just really like playing games. So here we go. So I'm pressing start, and you guys should be able to see on my screen what it looks like. We want to click on the characters that have a characteristic of PBIS and avoid the characters that have something that don't fit into PBIS. So here we go. I'm going to play a little game. Oh, neither of those things are right. I'm not going to click on either of those. So I'm just going to wait, which is the hardest part. Expectations and rules, that's a critical element. We don't excuse misbehavior, we just teach appropriate responses. Effective discipline, that's another one. Effective discipline, implementation plan is a critical element, expectations and rules, there we go. So we have 4 levels in this game. I just made it through that first level. And I got a time bonus. Now, if you've made it through those 4 levels already and you want to share your score, come on back to the meeting room and do that. Mental health, yes, that's one of those things. Reward system, relationships. Oh, we don't shame students. Lesson plans, here we go. I'm halfway through. And a time bonus, woohoo. All right, got more characters. What do we have here? Classroom systems, discipline, rewards, classrooms, data entry, effective discipline, expectations, mental health, classrooms. All right, almost through. And again, if you've completed the game, come on back to the meeting chat and let us know how you did. 308, way to go, Karen. Data entry, relevant for students, student voice, relationships, rewards, data entry, implementation, evaluation, discipline. Oop, I missed one. All right, so, oh, Justin, 309, way to go. Oh, 314. Now I gotta not count myself in this because I designed the game. So there are a couple of ways that you can close out this activity. The leaderboard will show you how everyone did. Again, I'm not going to add my name there. And it looks like Karen and Justin, you guys also skipped that particular step, which is cool. But Allie, way to go, 99. You are first because you actually are claiming credit for that. So if we go back, you can also show the answers, right? So that'll tell you what all the correct answers are. Now I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint presentation here because I also have them for you on the next slide. So congratulations. I think Justin got the highest score, although Karen, you were right there with him. So nice work on that one. I'm curious, did folks find anything surprising about this activity? You can use your microphone or you can type into chat. Okay. If you did find something surprising, like maybe there was a correct answer that you weren't expecting would be a correct answer, or an incorrect answer that you weren't expecting to be incorrect, that's always a possibility. Hey, Simone, I saw your score there, 311. Nice job. Nice job. Oh, excellent. So it was very informative and you can share with others on the teams. 100%. I created these and you can access them through that QR code at any time. I don't expect that those activities will go away anytime soon. So feel free to use them at will to see how your staff are doing and to maybe jumpstart some conversations with your staff about what PBIS is and is not. So again, those answers are listed here on the slide for you. The first 10 correct answers that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, those are your 10 critical elements for Tier 1 PBIS. And those are the areas that we look at to determine if Tier 1 is being implemented with fidelity. So it includes things that are easy to see, such as your expectations, rules, lesson plans, discipline procedures, your classroom systems, and your reward system. But it also includes some things that are harder to observe, such as your teaming processes, faculty commitment, data entry and analysis, implementation planning, and evaluation. Now, in addition to those 10 critical elements, there are also some characteristics that describe how those 10 critical elements are implemented that are central to achieving the important outcomes of today, such as student voice and relevant practices, data and practices that address mental health, using trauma-informed practices and relationship-based approaches. So all of those things are a part of Tier 1 PBIS. Now, in contrast, PBIS does not include practices that shame students for their behavior. We don't include formal or informal policies that avoid creating a paper trail of students' situationally inappropriate behavior, and we don't ignore situationally inappropriate behavior too. These are myths that we still hear amongst school staff, even though we've been implementing Tier 1 PBIS for a couple of decades now. Let's see. PBIS should also be based on all stakeholders' values and beliefs, as opposed to those of just the school staff or the PBIS team members, which is something else that we see kind of on a historical basis. Is many times it's just the PBIS team coming up with school-wide expectations, coming up with rules, coming up with discipline practices, and all of those things should be informed by not just your staff, but also your students and families. So finally, all behavior-related initiatives, such as character education, relationship building, all of those other behavior-related things, should use your school's Tier 1 expectations and be integrated into each of the 10 critical elements, rather than implemented as standalone approaches. So for example, if you're using an anti-bullying curriculum, then that anti-bullying curriculum should be paired with your Tier 1 expectations. So when we're doing this step of the anti-bullying program, how does it align with our Tier 1 expectation? If you're engaging in evaluation to see how that anti-bullying program is working for you, you would evaluate that program just like you evaluate Tier 1 PBIS. So if you see any of the answers on the right-hand side of the screen taking place in a school, then you can use that as a sign that some additional support is needed for effective implementation and outcomes. And I'm just going to catch up with the chat real quick here. Yes, and Simone, you'll get that transcript. that will be a part of the recording as well. Okay. Now, as school administrators, you all have a critical role in making those 10 critical elements of PBIS work. Now, schools really need their leaders to demonstrate active participation and commitment to the PBIS framework. And that can be done by actively participating in PBIS meetings, talking about the PBIS framework with staff, students, and families, ensuring that behavior is written into the school improvement plan so that you have some funds available to engage in different practices, and making sure that time and resources are available to staff so they have time to develop and implement those strategies to use within the PBIS framework. So administrator active commitment and demonstration of that commitment is really central to making PBIS work in schools. Most schools need to engage in some degree of a shift in mindset, going from a very reactionary, punitive approach to something that is much more proactive, relationship-based, and educational. And so they need their leaders to demonstrate that actively to really allow that change to take hold. So you all play an important role in that. Now, another thing that administrators can do to support PBIS and ensure that it's implemented with fidelity is to help their staff stay current on training. There are a number of recordings on the FLPBIS project website, including one that's designed for new team members, administrators that are new to schools that implement PBIS. There are updates to Tier 1 practices, a recording on that you can access. There are a couple of modules for problem solving for Tier 1 and Tier 2 and more, including some modules for specific strategies like verbal de-escalation, relationship building strategies, and climate building strategies. So if you are unaware of those resources, I really encourage you to go to our website and check those out. The loveliness of our website and having those recorded trainings is you all and your staff can access them at any time. And then if you're working at the district level and you're here with me today and you have multiple schools that are interested in these topics, I encourage you to reach out to the project. You have a project contact, and you can also explore having more face-to-face opportunities as well. Okay. Another broad approach, universal screening. Now, universal screening is an approach by itself, but it is also part of the PBIS framework, and it's particularly important for reducing suspension. Part of this includes ensuring that students who appear to have additional needs have contacted your Tier 1 system with fidelity. So in other words, if we have a student who looks like they're struggling with situationally inappropriate behavior, we need to make sure that they've been taught what's expected and that they've received reinforcement for engaging in those behaviors. If those two conditions aren't true, then they have not yet contacted your universal system of support. The other part with universal screening is making sure that you're using multiple data sources to proactively identify students who are in need of additional support, rather than waiting until their needs are expressed in a situationally inappropriate way. So some of those data sources you can use include teacher, family, or self-nominations. You can use early warning system data, and there are also formal screeners that you can use as well. The goal here is to use screeners that provide good information so that students don't fall through the cracks, and so that Tier 2 supports can be targeted to student needs. So the better the match to intervention, the better fit of Tier 2 supports, and the better outcomes for students. And so universal screening, if you're doing it formally or more informally, that is a really key piece of that puzzle. Now, building on the idea of including universal screening as a way to reduce suspension, a multi-tiered system of supports implemented with fidelity is another approach to minimize the need for exclusionary discipline. Once students are identified as having certain types of needs, then additional instruction, opportunities to practice and receive feedback on their skills, and other types of supports are provided at increasing levels of intensity until the school identifies what the student needs to be successful. So some examples of interventions that could be provided to students are listed here on the slide for you. Now, most of these particular examples are not dependent on any specific program or curriculum. These are things that you could check in with your school psychologist for, your guidance counselors, your ESE departments within your districts, and they can help you design these particular strategies. But there are also some that have curricula that you can purchase that is a little bit of an easier way to implement sometimes. So Check and Connect is one example of that. It's a mentoring intervention that's designed to spot early signs of disengagement, improve school performance, and reduce school dropout. The key here is that the interventions, programs, and curricula that you choose are based on the needs of your students, and that they have some evidence to suggest that they'll be effective with students in your school's population. Your universal screening would help with that. Okay, so I'm going to take a break from talking for a minute, and I'm going to introduce everyone to another activity. And so again, you can access that activity by scanning the QR code or by clicking on the link that you see at the bottom of the slide. So we're going to think about our universal screening. We're going to think about our multi-tiered system of support, and we're going to talk about what that might look like in the real world. So we have a school. They administered their universal screening tool. They proactively identified students in need of supplemental support and provided them with some targeted interventions, but ultimately found that one student in particular, they had a disability and they needed more intensive support. So the school took steps to increase the intensity of those tier 2 interventions. For example, they could add more frequent check-ins to a student's check-in, check-out intervention. They can add specific and individualized goals to the student's behavior report card. And they can also have the school's behavior coach drop in and visit the student once each morning and afternoon, just to offer additional encouragement and or instruction to help keep the student on track, right? So this is a student who does have more intensive needs, and the school's responding to those needs by intensifying those tier 2 interventions or that particular tier 2 intervention. Now, in spite of this, one day the student pulls the fire alarm and they trigger a school-wide evacuation. Whoa, that's a big one, right? So in the Padlet, what I would like you all to do is to respond to the few questions that you see at the top of the screen. And it looks like we have some folks who are already doing that, which is terrific. So the first question that we have in the Padlet is, according to your district's code of conduct, what would be the likely consequence for this infraction? So we have a student with a disability receiving supports, and they pull the fire alarm and they wind up evacuating the entire school. So one idea is a manifestation determination, reteach, escort the student in the hallways to prevent them, right? We might also have disruption on campus violation and a recommended expulsion. Now, if you guys want, you can comment on examples that have been listed already. You can do that just by typing in there. You can also like examples. If someone lists an answer that you would already list yourself, you can just like those to show more support for those. But after you've identified what the likely consequence would be in this particular scenario, my next question for you is, would the consequence that you use impact the student's access to a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE? Because remember, this is a student who's been identified as having a disability. Your free and appropriate public education is a provision of regular or special education and related aids and services that are designed to meet the individual educational needs of students with disabilities as adequately as the needs of non-disabled students are met. So that's your free and appropriate public education. So if you're using, for example, disruption on campus and an expulsion, would that impact the student's FAPE? And I would say in this particular example, yes, it would definitely impact the student's FAPE. All right, we have someone else's ideas. Discipline cannot prevent FAPE, right? Because everyone is subject to the same disciplinary policies, right? Now, the third question that we have on the Padlet is, what should be considered if the student repeatedly engaged in this behavior? And so right away, we have some folks who are right on top of this. They would say, what we need to identify what's happening before the behavior occurs. We'd have to figure out, what does the student get out of the behavior? So what's the function of that behavior? That is true. And a lot of that goes into that manifestation determination meeting because your functional behavior assessments are usually a part of that manifestation determination. All right, so I'm going to look around. We've got some support for reteaching and escorting the student in the hallway. MDR. Reteach appropriate behavior, give examples of when we use the fire alarm and when we don't. I love those educational responses. That is terrific. Those educational responses, by the way, would not impact a student's access to free and appropriate public education, which is another reason why I like them so much. And that's also going to help you out with that third column that you see on the Padlet activity. All right, so I'm looking around to see if we have any more folks who are responding here. It doesn't look like anyone is typing. So I'm going to take us back to that PowerPoint presentation. Try to anyways. Here we go. All right. So there were a couple things that I wanted to point out with that. And actually, I've got kind of the formal things to point out on the left-hand side of this slide, but I'm going to go ahead and show them in more general terms as well. So the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services, they published some guidance back in 2016, and they published some guidance again this past July that clarified the requirements for behavioral supports for all students who have a disability, including students who have learning disabilities. In general terms, they specified that whenever a student's access to a free and appropriate public education may be impacted, such as when a student is suspended from school, the IEP team should consider whether behavioral supports are needed. And so that's regardless of whether the student has been identified as having an emotional behavioral disorder, if they've been identified as having a learning disability, et cetera. If they have a disability and they receive something that impacts their FAPE, then we had to consider behavioral supports. Now, if a behavior that results in repeated removals from school occurs, so in the event that the student keeps pulling that fire alarm, then the IEP team for the student should also consider if the supports the student was receiving were provided with fidelity. And if they were provided with fidelity, then the IEP team should consider whether different supports are necessary. Now, federal guidance also mentions that anytime the behavior of a student with a disability impedes their learning or the learning of others, that positive behavior interventions and supports should be among the supports considered by the IEP team, which you all did a really good job of doing in your response on the Padlet, right? You immediately went to those educational responses. Now, the reason that I bring this up, especially in the context of this presentation, is because of what we have come to learn about Tier 3 behavioral supports, which include that functional behavior assessment, or FBA, and the behavior improvement plans, or BIPs. Now, while the quality of FBAs and BIPs have increased over the years, we still see many instances where the technical adequacy of these tools is lacking. As you can see in this table, in a sample of over 100 FBAs, BIPs, students' plans contain an average of only about 50% of the necessary components. This suggests that our current system for providing individualized and intensive behavior support could result in incomplete or inappropriately targeted intensive supports for students, which of course could result in behavior that violates the code of conduct. The big takeaway message here is that if you have a student with a disability who engages in conduct violations, it's important to consider the type and quality of behavioral supports currently being provided. Now, our project offers a tool as well as other supports that can be used to evaluate the FBAs and BIPs. It's called the TATE, which is what you see here on the slide. You can use this, I would recommend using it proactively to identify areas of strength and weaknesses, or if you wanted to review a student's FBA, BIP, you could also review it that way as well. Now, the tool, it does require some expertise to complete. So if you're interested in using it, I would really encourage you to reach out to your FLPBISTA contact for additional information and support. Okay. Another way that our project can assist with Tier 3 behavior supports is by helping your district to develop a multi-tiered system within Tier 3. So when Tier 2 supports aren't sufficient for a student, there is an evidence-based way to provide FBAs and BIPs in an efficient manner so that students are quickly provided more intensive support that has a good likelihood of supporting them. We also help districts develop systems for progress monitoring. So if the efficient level of the FBA BIP isn't adequate, personnel will be able to identify that early on and provide increasingly intensive or individualized supports as they're needed. So the prevent, teach, reinforce model of the FBA BIP process is that evidence-based positive behavior support process for developing and implementing individualized functional assessments and behavior intervention plans. PTR, prevent, teach, reinforce, PTR targets challenging behaviors that have not been successfully addressed through Tier 1 classroom and or Tier 2 behavioral supports, and it's appropriate for any student experiencing significant behavioral difficulties. A skill development module on PTR is available to prepare district coordinators and other district personnel so that they're able to train school-based personnel as PTR facilitators across the district. So again, if you would like to learn more about this process, you can visit the Tier 3 page on our project's website, or if you're familiar with your project's contact person, you can reach out to them directly for more details on how to get started. All right, another way to reduce the need for suspension is to increase the capacity of all staff to provide some form of function-based support. Now, teachers do not have to be behavior analysts to formulate reasonable hypotheses about why a student is engaging in a particular behavior. When teachers are supported to develop function-based hypotheses, and that's in a very simple way like you see depicted on the slide, then they can avoid responding to situationally inappropriate behavior in a way that strengthens it. So for example, if a student is engaging in disruption in order to get away from an activity, sending the student to a timeout area or down to the front office is not going to be an effective consequence. It's actually probably going to increase the chances of the student engaging in disruption again. So again, if you're interested in this, the FLPBIS project can connect your school teams with resources and activities that will help to build staff capacity for identifying behavioral function. Okay, so a final broad approach is to use instructional practices and behavioral supports that are relevant for the students and the staff who need them. Now, there's been a good amount of research in recent years showing that students from different racial and ability groups don't always receive the same benefit from systems of support for behavior. And one hypothesis for that is that the supports are not always relevant or meaningful to diverse students. The quickest way I can summarize a strategy for overcoming this is to take a strength-based approach to analyzing your data and providing support. This includes being aware and supportive of students' backgrounds, building positive relationships with students and their families, approaching situationally inappropriate behavior with empathy, that's a big one, and empowering students and their families to take a leading role in addressing any disparities that are identified. So understandably, there is a lot that can go into these different approaches. And so if you're interested in receiving some support with that, again, I encourage you to reach out to your FLPBIS contact person. Okay, so we are a little more than halfway through our time together. So far today, we've talked about a few different broad approaches to reducing suspension, and that encompass a number of different strategies. But we're going to kind of narrow in our focus and look at more specific strategies in this last section. Again, as a reminder, this session is being recorded, so if you need to step away for a moment and take a break, you can always come back and catch up on what you missed. All right, so jumping in. So it's kind of interesting. We had some researchers interview school administrators to learn more about the reasons why they use suspension with their students. And after interviewing a number of different administrators, reviewing the interview results, they identified a few themes in the reasons administrators gave for using out-of-school suspension. And so those themes, they would say that they use suspension to get parents' attention about a student's behavior. They use suspension so that they're deterring other students from engaging in certain behaviors. They use suspension sometimes to improve the learning environment, to provide temporary relief to teachers, or sometimes too just to remove the offending student. It's literally a safety issue, and so they need to get the student out of that setting. The thing is that for each one of these different types of rationales, we have more effective ways of accomplishing that same goal. So what we're going to do in the next section here is we're going to look at those different rationales for exclusion and look at some of these other strategies that we can use instead. Okay, so that first rationale is that we use suspension in order to get families' attention. There are a lot of other ways we can accomplish that. And what I would recommend is that your school and or district think about a multi-tiered approach to engaging with family members. Basically, what this says is that there are certain strategies that schools and districts can use with all families. And for many families, those strategies like a newsletter or the school marquee, letters home to family members, those low-key, low-intensive strategies can be really effective for some families. But within the school population, some families need a little bit more effort before they engage with the school or before they give you the attention you're seeking to discuss the student's behavior. And so some other ways of getting family engagement and putting a little more effort into that would be maybe walking students home, listening sessions with different focus groups of students, having push out events in the community, and using activities that family members are already engaged in, like at the high school level, maybe lots of families come to basketball games. And so you could piggyback onto the basketball games to get more feedback from families. Helping families get to different activities is another kind of a tier 2 strategy. Now, across a school and or district, you may have schools that are using a variety of intensive or not quite as intensive strategies, but a varying intensity strategies with their families. And what you find is that even that's not enough. And there are still some families who are very reluctant to engage with you. And so for that, you would look at your tier 3 family engagement strategies, right? And so that could be having positive home visits with family members. And the key there is that it literally is a positive event with the family. And so reaching out to families and building the relationship proactively, if you know you haven't always heard from them in the past, but you know you need to, that intensive strategy can be very effective for building a bridge and being able to engage with families. There are other things like personal invitations to different events. We have had situations where school principals have called up a student's family and said, hey, I would really like you to come to this particular thing. We need to hear from you. And having that personal phone call, that personal invite was literally all that it took for someone to realize, oh, this is important. If the school principal is calling me about this, I should really try to get there, right? Also, other supports for families to make them want to come to your campus, such as having resource rooms or resource nights. We've heard of some very, very creative scenarios where schools offer nursing services, tax preparation services, et cetera, food banks we've heard. And all of those different, much more intensive strategies are really effective at getting some of the most reluctant families to engage with the school. Now, there are also ways of getting parents' attention after situationally inappropriate behavior occurs as well. And so tier 2 supports, that would be one way of doing that. So check in, check out is a really easy tier 2 intervention. And as part of that intervention, there's a daily point sheet where the parent reviews their child's progress and they can comment and sign the daily point sheet card. So that's one way of getting parents' attention. Some schools have family members come in for classroom observations. Others go so far as to have a family member shadow their child throughout the school day so they can see up close and personal what those behaviors look like. We have several districts across Florida which offer a type of weekly class for students and their family members that can be completed in lieu of suspension. So each of those strategies offers a more inclusive and a more instructional approach for getting family members' attention for situationally inappropriate behavior. An example of the strategy with the weekly class, actually Highlands County, if you all are here today, you all have a program where principals can offer an alternative to suspension. The program is called STATS. So students enrolled in the STATS program would serve individualized study services in lieu of OSS, in addition to attending a prescribed number of Monday evening seminars, and a parent has to attend with them. So those seminars cover things like consequences of your actions, anger management, moral reasoning skills, and dealing with peer pressure. So upon successful completion of STATS, the work that the student completed in the individual study services would be counted for their grades. Failure to complete the seminar would result in an out-of-school suspension. Highlands County does that. We also have Palm Beach, Osceola counties that offer something like that, and I'm confident many more do as well. Those were just the ones that came to mind right off the bat. Okay. Now, another rationale for using suspension is that you would use suspension as a way of deterring other students from engaging in similar behaviors. Now, there are much more powerful strategies that you can use to do that instead. Now, behavior-specific praise is an evidence-based strategy that's associated with a host of positive outcomes, many of which you see here listed on the slide. There's research showing that behavior-specific praise is highly underutilized in general, and there's emerging research showing that it's not always used in a balanced way across student groups. So in addition, we know that higher levels of reprimands were associated with higher levels of emotional exhaustion in teachers. So if we can increase teachers' use of behavior-specific praise, then we are helping to reduce that level of emotional exhaustion in teachers. And that's because behavior-specific praise can be so effective at reducing situationally inappropriate behaviors. Now, another strategy that's kind of related to that is differential reinforcement. And that's where students who are in close proximity to each other, or to a student who is engaging in situationally inappropriate behaviors, those students that are behaving according to expectations are provided behavior-specific praise and sometimes also an external reward for engaging in those desired behaviors. So differential reinforcement is behavior-specific praise for students who are demonstrating the expectations and not providing reinforcement to the student engaging in situationally inappropriate behaviors. Now, as an administrator, you can support your teachers' use of these strategies by including them on your classroom walkthroughs. I'm curious, for folks who are with us this morning, if anyone already has the number of behavior-specific praise statements included on their classroom walkthroughs. If you do, let me know through the chat or by raising your hand in Zoom, because that is a big deal. Now, and also let me clarify, behavior-specific praise is not as simple as just hearing a teacher say, "Hey, Johnny, good job." You actually have to name the behavior, name the student, right? So the student knows exactly what they did. You can also tie in that school-wide expectation to say why it was such a great thing. Say, "Hey, Johnny, I see you getting your books out right after I asked you to do that. Thank you for being responsible and being so on task," right? Okay, so as administrators, you can support your teachers' use of these strategies by including them on your walkthroughs. What you can do is aim to obtain a ratio of positive to neutral or negative directions or statements that the teacher makes. And with that ratio, then you can see, does the teacher have some room for improvement? If you have teachers who have that 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 or 8-to-1 ratio, we've heard different ratios are effective. But even if they just have that 4-to-1 ratio, find out how they managed to make that happen and share that with the rest of your staff. All right. So now every school's decision to use suspension impacts a district standing with regards to state identification of significant disproportionality. So many times a student code of conduct requirements are not always that clear for administrators. So it's important that we're always going back and checking our understanding of the policies. We've seen a number of examples and heard from a number of administrators where their decision to use suspension or long-term suspension was based on a misunderstanding of minimum disciplinary requirements. So I'm going to do a little pop quiz for everyone here today. So I have a couple of examples for you. So this first example you see here, this is drawn from one of the districts that's supported by ISERD, but I won't say which one. And what this lays out is the responses for a first offense, alcohol, controlled substance, hallucinogenic, counterfeit drugs, yada, 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 possession, right? So what they say is at the elementary level, the consequence is up to the principal and or OSS up to 10 days and mandatory parent conference with the school board or designee. At the secondary level, expulsion is the response for first offense of alcohol, controlled substance. So let me ask you a question. First question, is a 10-day out of school suspension required in this example? Let me know yes or no through the chat. No, from Karen. Other ideas? Janice says no. Ellen, hey, this is great. Correct. A 10-day suspension is not required at either elementary or secondary level. And let me ask a next question. Is any out of school suspension required in this example? Yes or no? Is any out of school suspension required? Let's focus specifically on the elementary level. And we're seeing lots of no's come up. Exactly. Principal's discretion at the elementary level. Nice work with this one. Let me try a new example for you all. Okay, now in this second example, we're looking at battery. Here we see the disciplinary guidelines for battery, which is considered a serious infraction or what we call a Cessor offense. So what we see here is with battery, the first offense is up to 10 days OSS and parent conference. Second offense, up to 10 days OSS, recommendation to superintendent for expulsion. So in the second example you see here on the slide, is a 10-day out of school suspension required in the second example? Excellent. Everyone's coming back with no, a 10-day out of school suspension is not required in the second example. Nice work with that. That's exactly right. Now, in the second example, is any out of school suspension required? Is any out of school suspension required? Again, we're looking at that second example on the bottom. All right, we have a couple different opinions. So no, it appears that yes for some. Yeah, looks like the majority of folks are saying yes. And the way that I'm reading this, I agree. Yes, some out of school suspension appears to be required. So that was an excellent job of differentiating when we have to use suspension versus when it's an option. And that's a really important thing for administrators to remember, particularly if they're trying to address disproportionate discipline. Nice work with that, you all. I appreciate your work on that. All right, so let me go on back here. Now, let me ask you all, because this moves into yet another strategy that we can use to reduce suspension. Let me ask, type through chat, or you can share through the microphone, why have students been suspended at your school? What are some of the most common reasons that they've been suspended? We have students pulling fire alarms, drugs, fighting, cussing out a teacher, repeated misbehavior such as physical aggression, drugs and fighting, sexual misconduct, fighting, perceived threat, premeditated planned fights, fighting, harsh profanity towards a teacher, marijuana, weapons on campus, yeah, tobacco, and constant severe classroom disruptions. Excellent. Thank you guys for sharing that. So I'm seeing a pretty big range of offenses that students received suspension for. When researchers actually have gone out, a national sample of schools to look at reasons why students were suspended, what they found is that the majority of suspensions were discretionary. So schools were not required to suspend students in the majority of examples. And also, in the majority of suspensions, they were written for nonviolent and rather subjective infractions. So for example, and this is not assigning blame or fault to anyone, but having an offense like a perceived threat is very subjective, right? What I perceive to be threatening and what someone else perceives to be threatening can be very different. So these are very subjective and discretionary things that we're writing suspensions for. And so one strategy is just straight up, and this is recommended by the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. They recommend that exclusionary discipline just is not used for nonviolent offenses. And that's for things like tardiness, absenteeism, of course, or subjective offenses such as defiance or disrespect. They said, just don't do it. We understand about the negative consequences that students experience as a result of receiving suspension. We know about the negative impact suspension has on school and classroom climate. So let's just not use it for some of these offenses. And that's another recommendation made by USDOE. So those are maybe some ways of improving the learning environment, but some other ways of improving the learning environment, which was one of the reasons principals gave for using suspension. Pre-correction is a very specific strategy that is also highly underutilized. It includes things like offering reminders, prompts, and brief role plays so that students really understand what's expected of them in different circumstances. It's more effective when teachers are aware of school-wide discipline trends and also trends within their own classroom in terms of behavior as well. And so the reason why I bring this up is many times when we talk with schools who are implementing Tier 1 PBIS, we ask, are they sharing school-wide data with faculty, school-wide faculty? And we get really mixed results. Some faculty don't ever recall seeing school-wide discipline trends. Something that they see very frequently is a list of students who have been suspended, but that is not the same as understanding that we're getting discipline spikes between 10 o'clock and 1 o'clock, and it occurs most often in a hallway and cafeteria, right? If I am armed with that more specific school-wide discipline trend information, then I know when I take my class out to go to either lunch or maybe their specials class, then before I leave the classroom, I'm providing some pre-correction so that students are more likely to engage in the behaviors that we want to see. So pre-correction is a really good strategy to introduce, and a really effective way of introducing that strategy is to make sure, whether it's through email or doing a faculty meeting or other formats, that you're sharing your school-wide discipline data with your staff so they can use pre-correction effectively. Now, there is another strategy that I'm going to talk about. So this is another strategy that would help to improve the learning environment, and it's called vulnerable decision points and neutralizing routines. So in the context of a disciplinary event, these would, I'm actually going to pause there and rewind just a little bit. So vulnerable decision points and neutralizing routines. Now, a vulnerable decision point refers to situations and conditions that are predictably challenging for you. So there are some situations that are challenging for lots of people, like, for example, trying to perform a complicated task when you're short on sleep and you're hungry and there's a hurricane that is bearing down on your area, right? We know that a lot of situations will be challenging under those circumstances. Now, there are also vulnerable decision points that are unique to individuals. So for example, I know that one of my vulnerable decision points is when I'm working with others to cut down on presentation content that I'm very passionate about. Like, I know that that is a trying situation for me. Now, in those situations, there are certain hot button behaviors that just really tend to set me off. I have an instantaneous reaction to certain things in those situations. For example, like in the process of trying to do this very difficult task, someone tells me that a particular instructional strategy is just impossible. We just should not do that. When that behavior happens during that challenging situation, I immediately feel frustrated and sometimes also a little angry. So my vulnerable decision point is that when people say a new strategy is impossible without explaining why, while I'm working with others to cut content that I'm passionate about, I'm likely to respond in a way that's not in line with my values, right? So that's my vulnerable decision point. Would anyone be willing to share a vulnerable decision point that they've noticed in themselves or others? You might also think of these as hot button behaviors that occur, again, under certain specific circumstances. Trying to take attendance when the class is very rowdy and you missed your second cup of coffee. Any examples like that? All right, and I won't actually require any responses if you don't feel comfortable sharing that right now. Oh, but Jerry, thank you. Okay, getting hit, kicked, and spit on in the face. I would agree with you. I actually would share that vulnerable decision point with you, especially if that behavior or those behaviors happened under certain circumstances. Like if I'm in a very chaotic environment to begin with, and those behaviors took place, it's a particularly trying situation for me. So yes, knowing what those vulnerable decision points are is a really important piece to this process. Now, when a hot button behavior pops up in the middle of a challenging situation, we are more likely to make a snap decision that's not in line with our values. So research has shown that these moments can have a disproportionate impact on culturally and linguistically diverse students. And we do have strategies that we can use to prevent them. And Simone, thank you for sharing that vulnerable decision point in chat. I see that there. Now, in terms of how to address these vulnerable decision points, we use the neutralizing routine. That is our go-to strategy for addressing those VDPs, or vulnerable decision points. The neutralizing routine has 2 steps. The first step is to identify your personal vulnerable decision points, like you all have shared in chat here. Sharita, I saw your response too. Thank you for that. So the VDP has 2 steps. First is to recognize what your VDP is. So that means that you're going to identify challenging situations during your school day, and then identify your hot button or triggering behaviors. And then also identify how you're feeling in those specific moments. So it's best to write those down in a private place so you can think through them fully. You can engage in some quality reflection on those situations, and also so you can go back throughout the year and reference them. So that's the first step. The second step is to develop a routine that you can use to prevent that snap decision from taking place. That's called a neutralizing routine. The goal of the neutralizing routine is to create space between the triggering behavior and your outward response. Neutralizing routines should help you delay a decision until a better time. It should provide enough space so that you can reframe the situation so you can think productively about a solution. And they should also help you to take care of yourself within the moment so that you have more personal resources available to respond. Neutralizing routines should be simple. They should be easy to remember, and they should be quick so you can use them when you most need them without losing traction in that challenging moment. So in my example, I've already identified my challenging situation, which is working with others to cut down on presentation content that I'm passionate about. My triggering behavior is saying that a new instructional strategy is impossible without explaining why. So something that I can do to create space between that triggering behavior and my outward reaction would be to apply my neutralizing routine. So when I'm working with others to cut down content that I'm passionate about, and someone tells me a new strategy is impossible without explaining why, and I feel myself getting frustrated or angry, then I can take 3 deep breaths, reframe their objection as an expression of a diverse perspective, which is something I value, and then ask them to explain their concern. This allows me to take care of myself in the moment with that deep breathing, reframing the situation as something that I value, and also create some space between the individual statement and my outward reaction to their idea. So my neutralizing routine in this example is short, it's simple, and it's actually been really effective in enabling a more balanced conversation when I'm in those particular situations. So the reason why we engage in these specific steps for these neutralizing routines, because when we first take that step of identifying our vulnerable decision points, then we can be on the lookout for those specific situations when we're more likely to need to use our neutralizing routine. So it's one thing to know that being kicked or bitten is a triggering behavior. If you know that you are more likely to be kicked or bitten during a certain part of the school day, or you're less likely to use the responses you would like to use if you're kicked or bitten when you've missed breakfast on a particular day. Then you can go into a situation and you're more likely to use your neutralizing routine. So knowing that in advance, it helps to prime us for using our strategy and helps to tailor the strategy to the situation at hand. Neutralizing routines can be something personal that you use for unique vulnerable decision points, like what I described before. And you also might have some common situations at your school where many people respond a certain way under certain conditions to specific behaviors. And so you come up with a shared neutralizing routine for many people within a classroom or even across the school. So for example, one example of that is the stop and think neutralizing routine. And so that could work for individuals during a common vulnerable decision point, such as in the cafeteria when things are very loud and noisy and someone knocks over something or bumps me in the line, then I have a preset way of responding. I would stop, take my 3 deep breaths, think about the best way to approach the situation, and then act. Now, once the neutralizing routines are developed, you can add prompts around your classroom, around your office, around your school, to remind you about using those routines in those places when you're most likely to need them. Vulnerable decision points and neutralizing routines use incredibly important emotional awareness and emotional regulation skills that can help administrators, teachers, and students both inside and outside of school. So this is a really powerful strategy, and it's also used a lot in schools trying to address disproportionate discipline. All right, verbal de-escalation, of course, is another very popular strategy. It's another alternative to suspension that can also help to address that rationale of improving the learning environment. So a large part of responding to situationally inappropriate behavior is knowing where the student is at on the verbal de-escalation continuum. So I'm guessing that folks are somewhat familiar, at least, with the verbal de-escalation continuum. Basically, you don't want to engage in a lot of teaching strategies or redirection strategies when a student's in crisis. You need to help them feel safe so that they can calm down, and also help other students nearby, ensuring that they are safe. A lot of this requires on staff recognizing signs of agitation early on. So if we can see early on that the student's tone of voice is changing, maybe the volume is changing, their posture changes, you might see more tension in students' muscles, then that is the point to intervene early, right? And really what you want to do is teach your teachers some things that they can do to prevent the crisis situation from happening. So there are different strategies to use at all different points of that de-escalation continuum. We have a handout that summarizes a lot of that. We also have an online learning module that goes into more detail on verbal de-escalation. All right, so now we have just a quick example here of a way of providing temporary relief to teachers. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this, and I'm going to hope that you all can hear it. If you can't, let me know in chat.
First, I'm going to read a quote. To succeed, you must first improve. To improve, you must first practice.
Young people have to be given space to grow and to feel like, okay, I made a mistake, but from this learning experience, I can continue to become better.
To learn, you must first fail.
When you're talking about student discipline, a lot of times we are punitive because it's faster and restorative takes more time. But restorative practices are better long-term. So at Procone, we have a place called The Zone, which we use in lieu of suspension.
Welcome to the zone.
It's a collaborative space where kids get into a circle and they discuss what their behaviors were and ways to correct it.
We have The Zone every morning from 7 to 9 a.m. Today, we had 8 students in The Zone.
We're here today to talk about how to make things right when we make mistakes, poor choices.
Usually the infractions are cell phone use, disrespect, cursing, but it could also be that there was an argument in a classroom or more aggressive behaviors that also get sent to us.
So even though you had a conflict that brought you here, if we can bring our best selves to this circle, we can get a lot done, we can learn from each other.
When students come in, we go over circle guidelines so that there are agreements that we hold within this space.
What does it mean to listen from the heart?
You're trying to feel like you're relating to the situation.
Just like showing respect to them.
Once we teach them really what the zone is and how this is not a space where there's a power dynamic between you and another person, then they kind of disarm and we get to what's causing that behavior.
I had somebody come to me and tell me that a friend said something bad about me. Most of the time when you're in trouble, you get a referral and you have a consequence. They don't really want to hear your side of the story.
Well, what happened?
When you come into Zone, they have a conversation with you and they kind of tell you how to solve your problem the positive way. I was able to go to her and work it out.
We're really just trying to get context. Whenever there's a conflict, right, both parties contribute to the conflict, right? Although you may not feel like you contributed to the problem, you played a piece in it. And that's a part of the social emotional learning that we're trying to get them to see. We really want to have a discussion about the things you can control.
I just need to catch myself and know my surroundings.
It is a place for students to process their role in it, understanding who is harmed, but then also understanding that it's okay to reflect on what you as a student needed in that situation.
I don't need anything from others to make it right because I can be mature on my own.
But how can we help you in the maturing process? Because we're gonna be here too. What I usually say is I don't want to change your behavior. I want you to think about it before you do it. Really, I've seen them becoming very intentional about what they do, what they say.
Everybody has to own up to their consequences.
And that's the whole purpose of the zone.
By me owning it, it's gonna help me better.
All right. So Erica had asked, what is the title of this video? This video comes from Edutopia, and the name of it is Restorative Circles, Creating a Safe Environment for Students to Reflect. And so what I will do is I'll just copy that URL. I'm going to paste that into the chat box here so you have it, and you can reference that as needed. I'm curious, does anyone with us this morning, does your school already use an intervention like that or a response like that in lieu of suspension? You can let me know by typing yes or no into the chat. No? Okay. Thank you, Mary. You were right on that. Excellent. And Erica, you'd like to see that implemented? Okay, very good. So this is something that's somewhat of a new idea. I would also love to see that implemented. I think that that would be a very interesting activity for one of your FLPBI STA contacts. I also think that is very powerful. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about reflection in the time that we have left together, and also a little bit about restorative practices, which our project is referring to as relationship-based practices, right? Because that's really what it boils down to. Simone, you use it each morning with your group along with skill streaming. Oh, I feel like I'm your spirit animal or spirit presenter, I guess I should say, because yes, that's exactly how I would use this too. My skill streaming is my go-to book for figuring out how to teach students more effective ways of expressing themselves. It's very simple for me to understand anyways, and it breaks things down in a very helpful way. But let me go ahead and get through this content. And then we can follow up with more general questions later on. Simone, I saw your comment there. You send them off with the words, be the best pirate you can or better. I love it. Thank you for that. Okay, now reflection is a more effective way of providing temporary relief to teachers. But there are some important considerations to make if you want to use reflection as an alternative to suspension. So if we go all the way back to Piaget, he proposed that introspective awareness of one's thoughts is an aspect of cognitive development that appears to emerge around age 7. Now, there's other evidence that has shown that it's not until the elementary school years that children become adept at describing the contents of their thoughts in a stream of consciousness, which is a required part of reflection. There is an abundance of research that's revealed that clear age-related improvements in the ability to purposefully adjust one's thoughts and behavior are observed in the first 2 decades of life. So for the entire time that we are with students, they will be constantly improving on their ability to reflect and change their behavior as a result. What this means is that we should not just place a student in a reflection room and assume that they will engage in meaningful reflection that leads to a change in their behavior. We have to teach and support students how to do this and give them feedback on their practice. Now, when it comes to helping students identify emotions or come up with ways to repair the harm that's caused by their actions, different character education, social and life skill curricula are great resources. And like Simone said, skill streaming, that is right at the top of my list. There are other resources you could use. Stanford Harmony is K through 5, but I think you can also stretch it into 6 and sometimes 7. It's also free for schools to use. There's other resources like Second Step and lots of other character ed curricula that can help you with this particular skill. Now, when you're thinking about developmentally appropriate reflection questions, you want to kind of break it down by the student's developmental level. So for early elementary aged students or students who function at an early elementary level, you want to keep your reflection questions short and limited in number. So students at this level, they may need support to answer the questions, which could include things like giving prompts to support their memories of the event. It could include sharing emotion cards to help students identify feelings, and sometimes providing hints about how to repair the harm that took place. Students functioning at more of a middle childhood level could be expected to have better recall. They might have better emotional awareness, maybe, and an improved ability to recognize others' feelings, maybe. They might also have more ideas on what they can do to repair the harm that's caused by their actions. Now, this all continues to improve into adolescence and young adulthood. And so you can see as we go along that developmental spectrum, how those questions become a little more nuanced, a little more detail oriented. Now, the main message I'd like you to take away from this slide is that a reflection sheet is not a one-size-fits-all strategy. And many students, including many of our older students, may need significant support to fully engage with that particular activity. So some considerations when determining the level of support a student may need. It includes the student's learning history. So if the student has little or no experience with the essential skills for reflection, such as describing events, identifying emotions, brainstorming strategies, they're going to need more interaction and assistance to successfully engage in reflection. Think about the student's existing relationship with school personnel. So if you are the person who will be providing assistance and or debriefing the reflection with the student, a lack of a positive relationship or maybe even a trust gap between yourself and the student can hinder their willingness to fully engage with that reflection assignment. So in those situations, your best bet will be to work proactively to establish a positive relationship with the student. Now, this is a best practice that provides a lot of other benefits, but if that hasn't happened, then you might begin the conversation with the student by attempting to establish some rapport. So sometimes it's okay to take a step back and just talk with the student, get to know them a little bit better. Now, one way of accomplishing this is to help the student de-escalate from the situation by helping them to feel heard, by acknowledging their perspectives and feelings, and supporting them to use relaxation techniques so that they can get to a point where they can talk about the event. You could also consider having the student complete the reflection assignment with a family member or a guardian of the student, or some other trusted adult who could provide emotional support to help the student talk openly about the event. You might also enlist another staff member altogether, someone who knows the student well and has a positive relationship with them. Another consideration is to keep the focus of the reflection on helping the student develop fluency with the problem-solving process. Now, this is an important life skill that takes time and lots of practice to do well, and it's also a cornerstone of learning how to take responsibility for one's own actions. Encouraging the student to engage in perspective taking is helpful for jump-starting the problem-solving process. But remember that perspective taking requires some skills that may not fully develop until the student is older. As the adult in the room, it's fine to offer ideas or suggestions, but too many times this evolves into the adult assigning the student a particular action, rather than coaching the student to find a solution and helping them to implement it. Another approach would be to encourage the student to gather information to identify possible solutions. So there are some relationship-based conversations that automatically include the perspectives of others that were involved in that incident, so that it's a little easier for a student to brainstorm ways of repairing the harm that was caused by their actions. In other situations, you could have the student interview a small number of individuals and learn about their recommendations for repairing the harm, and then the student could choose one of those recommendations. Now, all of those things takes more time than just assigning a disciplinary action to an event, but it also leads to innovative solutions. It leads to improved relationships and stronger problem-solving skills in our students. Now, a final thing here is your capacity for separating the doer from the deed. So the administrator's beliefs about discipline are actually the strongest predictor of a school's discipline outcomes. Knowing this, it's important to be aware of situations and conditions that can cause us to act in ways that don't align with our goal of supporting every student to be successful. There's been some research that delves into the topic, and there are a few strategies that have been shown to effectively combat these circumstances. Acquiring deep personal knowledge of students and their families is a powerful one, along with establishing a history of positive interactions with the student. So again, this goes back to the importance of being proactive and positive with our students and their families. Now, not to mention, if your school has a small number of students who receive multiple disciplinary infractions, your best bet would be to start getting to know these students more personally and having positive interactions with them. So this is something that most of your schools will be able to do right away as soon as we return to school after this week's weather events. So if you know that there are some students who have some repeated behaviors, now is the time to start building relationships with them. Other strategies to help you separate the doer from the deed include maintaining personal and professional humility, acknowledging that we're all human and humans are imperfect in their ability to accurately sense everything that happens around them. And this puts us in a frame of mind where we can be open to hearing and accepting a student's perspective of events that led to a disciplinary interaction. This also makes it easier for us to have and to demonstrate empathy for a student, even in challenging situations. Another trick to help you separate the doer from the deed is to imagine the student before you as a highly successful adult, a surgeon, an oncologist, a principal, an engineer, a scientist, you name it. This trick will help you reframe the student's behavior into a strength rather than a deficit. Now, I'm wondering if anyone has other strategies for helping separate the doer from the deed. Please go ahead and type those into chat, because this would be a list we can all stand to improve on. So all of this kind of leads into the next idea about relationship-based practices. This is a wide variety of different practices that you can use to build relationships, to address harm that was caused by a person's actions, and to restore the community after an event like that has taken place. What I would like you to take away from the slide is that there are many, many different relationship-based strategies that you can choose from. Some of them are proactive and preventative, such as even just using social and behavioral life skill instruction, maybe having checking in circles, using affective statements and scripts as part of your discipline hierarchy, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are also a number of different ways of using relationship-based strategies after harm has occurred in order to support the student to repair that harm. Now, those reactive strategies take more time and they are much, much more effective if you already have a relationship with that student in the first place. And so for that reason, when our project teaches on relationship-based strategies, we always begin by teaching teams to implement those proactive, preventative, climate building strategies, like those affective statements and community building circles, so that we can start to build those relationships, which will help us when we have to use these different relationship-based strategies as a response to situationally inappropriate behavior. So something else to keep in mind is that with all of these different strategies, because they can take more time, it's good to use Tier 1 PBIS with fidelity, so that will initially reduce the number of disciplinary events to begin with. So if we implement PBIS with fidelity, the number of disciplinary events goes down. That's what we've seen over decades of research now. And when we have a lower number of disciplinary events, then it frees some time up to engage in community building and more relationship-based responses. All right. So these are a couple of different examples of those relationship-based responses. You'll have the slides so you can reference these as needed. There are some situations where you do need to use in-school suspension to address situationally inappropriate behavior. This slide lists out some characteristics that will make your in-school suspension more effective, such as making sure there's a continuation of academic support and accommodations, making sure that your in-school suspension includes behavioral, social, and life skill instruction, support, and counseling. And also that if you're using in-school suspension, then you're also checking to see how students are doing after they've received it. So for example, if you have some students who frequently receive in-school suspension, they may be finding that more rewarding than being in their classroom, right? So we want to make sure that if we're using in-school suspension, it's having the impact that we expect. All right, a final piece here, and this is frequently a new piece for schools, is including some sort of reintegration process as part of their disciplinary procedures. The idea here is after a behavior has caused harm, then the student does something to repair the relationship. The student is therefore welcomed back into the classroom or school community, and they can return to learning. The idea with reintegration strategies, there are a lot of relationship-based strategies we can use, ranging from apologies to reflection sheets to restorative conferences. Lots of different strategies we can use. But what we want to do is make sure that we are aligning the intensity of our reintegration strategy to the intensity of the incident that we're addressing. So for example, if a student is receiving a classroom managed consequence because they called out during instruction, we are not going to have a whole restorative conference to address that student's behavior. That's overkill, right? So we want to make sure that we're aligning the intensity of our reintegration with the intensity of the behavior incident. So overall, today in our time together, we have covered a number of different ways of creating a comprehensive discipline system. And again, this is something that our project includes in our Tier 1 training. We can also do booster trainings that focus more specifically on that discipline hierarchy. We also have trainings in integrating relationship-based strategies into Tier 1 PBIS. So those are all things that we can help you with. We have just a couple minutes left if you all have any questions or comments, and please feel free to use your microphones here as a time saver for folks. But if you don't have any questions or comments, you've got our contact information that's provided on the last slide. And as you exit the meeting room, you should encounter a little short evaluation just to let us know how we did today. And if you could complete that for us, that is something else that our funders require of our discretionary projects, is just to see how we're doing. So if you can give us that feedback, I would very much appreciate that. And other than that, I want to thank folks for their participation this morning. You all have been great. I so appreciated hearing your ideas in the chat. So thank you for that. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here, though.
Thank you so much, Teresa. We appreciate Therese. I apologize.